Thank you all for joining us this morning. We look forward to sharing our projects with you and hearing your comments and questions later in the webinar. So today we're going to present information from two different projects about high tunnels. The first is a study that was funded by the Indiana State Department of Agriculture Specialty Crop Block Grant. That project looked at how farmers are using high tunnels in Indiana. We wanted to measure the farm level impacts of high tunnels and learn what farmers see as the benefits and opportunities, but also the challenges and things they wish they would have known before investing in their high tunnel. So that study was led by James Farmer at Indiana University in collaboration with Liz Maynard at Purdue University. My name is Annalena Bruce, and I'm a postdoc researcher here at Indiana University, and I manage the case studies that were a part of this project. So I got to visit 20 farms around Indiana to learn about how farmers were managing their high tunnels and what experiences they were having. So I'll be serving as the chair of our webinar today. Later in the program, we'll be hearing about a project led by Liz Maynard with Michael O'Donnell that was funded by SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Grant of the USDA, that was focused on winter production in high tunnels. So immediately following the webinar, you'll be routed to a very brief survey with just a few follow-up questions that are required by our funder to help us improve future offerings. So please fill that out. It'll just take a couple minutes. Okay, so we can get started. We're going to have 3 segments today presented by 3 panelists. So let me introduce our speakers. In the first segment, we'll have James Farmer from Indiana University Bloomington. James is an associate professor in the School of Public Health, and he's also the founder and director of the new IU campus farm. James will be talking about how high tunnels are being used in Indiana. He'll cover structure selection, site considerations and preparation, what's worth paying for, and how to prepare for high winds. Then immediately following James's segment, we'll have a Q&A so you can ask him questions. After that, we'll hear from our guest speaker, Kara Bergschneider, the district conservationist for Monroe and Brown counties. She'll give the brief high tunnel success story. Then we're going to take a 5-minute break, and after the break, we'll have Liz Maynard, the clinical engagement assistant professor in horticulture in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture at Purdue University. Liz will be talking about planting arrangements, environmental management, soil management, weed and pests, and irrigation. And after Liz speaks, we'll have a Q&A so you can ask Liz questions. And then finally, in part 3, we'll hear from Michael O'Donnell. Michael is the new Organic and Diversified Agriculture Extension Educator for Purdue University. Michael will be talking about winter production in high tunnels. And after he presents, we'll have another Q&A session. So you'll have 3 opportunities to add your comments and questions today. Okay, so let's get started. I'll turn it over to James.
Good morning, everyone. Glad you could join us today and appreciate your time. Hopefully, you'll find this information as interesting and useful as we do. So in the past couple of years, Annalena, myself, and Liz, and a few others, Michael, we've been working to evaluate, to study the high tunnel growers in the state of Indiana. And so we've done a combination of some survey work as well as on-the-farm visits, and many of you helped us out connecting with growers for that work, and we thank you very much. To give you some ideas of our findings, farmers indicated that installing and growing in a high tunnel has, 1, improved the farm's economic stability, 2, provided for major improvements to quality of harvest, 3, reduced some disease problems and weed pressures, 4, increased product shelf life and yield, and finally, it protects produce from adverse weather events. Overall, we found that Indiana high tunnel growers have had a positive experience, in particular for extending the growing season and improving product quality and yield year-round. Nearly half the growers we spoke to are now harvesting in the cooler months and planting earlier in the spring, crops such as lettuce, spinach, and kale, while another half only use the infrastructure in the summer to improve the growth and production of warm season crops like tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. Indiana farmers report annually earning a total revenue of about $1.70 per square foot of high tunnel space. Consequently, high tunnels are an increasingly important piece of the farm infrastructure. However, high tunnels can be labor-intensive to manage, and high tunnel production is vulnerable to a number of weather, disease, and pest-related challenges requiring advanced preparation, knowledge, and adequate investment of time and money to manage successfully. Opportunities and challenges with high tunnels. Hoosier farmers are utilizing high tunnels in a wide variety of ways, adapting them to meet their individual needs and farm business goals. Here are some of the ways. At the center of the farm business, these farms are producing specialty crops year-round in their high tunnels, planting root vegetables and winter greens in late summer and early fall that they harvest through the winter and early spring. Others getting a head start on early tomatoes and other summer fruiting crops that fetch a price premium and continue producing into the fall. Farmers who have made high tunnel production the center of their business typically keep their high tunnel in use year-round. The advantages are they take advantage of off-season markets such as winter farmers markets, restaurants, and CSAs, price premiums for early and late produce, year-round income, ability to attract and keep great workers, and an ability to grow greenhouse-specific high-yielding varieties. For farm diversification, some farmers utilize high tunnels to provide an additional revenue stream on the side, while their primary focus might be field crops and orchard or field vegetable production. For them, the high tunnel is a side business, perhaps for their teenage kids or other family members. The benefits include 1, experimenting with growing high-value specialty crops such as cut flowers, delicate perennials, or berries. 2, adding a unique or popular product to attract customers at farmers markets or make their CSA more competitive. Or 3, add a side revenue stream such as a transplant or bedding plant production. They also use it as part of a small part-time business or entry point for new and beginning farmers. Many farms are using high tunnels to do a small-scale vegetable operation for local markets, this includes opportunities for beginning farmers with limited experience to increase their income as they learn and grow, a strategy for maximizing income on limited or marginal land, and finally, they get higher NRCS Environmental Quality Incentives Program payments, as well as advanced payments are available to beginning socially disadvantaged and veteran and limited income farmers when they apply for the cost share. You get out of what you put into it. The most common experience we heard from Indiana farmers growing in high tunnels is you get out of it what you put into it. In other words, receiving a significant return on investment in a high tunnel depends on the amount of labor and attention you're able to put into managing your high tunnel. Farmers that invest more time and labor into the high tunnel are also obtaining a higher return. These farmers are typically managing at least 2 tunnels and make them the center of the farm business. However, if you're already struggling to keep up with your farm business, adding a high tunnel may be more of a burden if you don't have the time to put into it. Likewise, if you don't have the financial resources to invest in a high-quality high tunnel, you could be at a higher risk of losing your tunnel to strong winds or experiencing structural damage that requires more time and money to fix. Be sure you're ready before you buy and know what you're getting into. High tunnel selection, choosing the right high tunnel for your farm. Several key considerations are critical when planning the construction of a high tunnel. While discussed separately, all the following factors work collectively and can impact the longevity and durability of your structure and overall high tunnel experience. High tunnel options. Clockwise from the top, you see image A is a caterpillar tunnel. Image B is a Quonset style with hoops made of PVC tubing and added wood support posts. Image C is a Quonset style with a little longer ground posts to create vertical sidewalls and simple vertical poly curtain end walls. Image D is a Gothic style tunnel with metal frame polycarbonate paneled end walls, large roll-up curtain doorway, and end wall vents above the door. These vary in shape, structural complexity, strength as they are pictured. The classic Quonset style tunnel is a half circle ground to ground. Some Quonsets are set on higher ground posts so they are straight sides before they have circle. The Gothic high tunnel design has a pointed roof that rises diagonally from the sidewalls to a peak. Many high tunnels in Indiana are single bay, meaning they have just one section. Some multi-bay structures are gutter connected. Structures are also in use. What kind of crops do you want to grow? Quonset style tunnels are typically lower cost, but headroom over the edge beds is very low in these tunnels unless they have tall sidewalls, which is a limitation for crops that grow tall and can be uncomfortable even for a shorter person using a walk-behind seeder or tiller near a sidewalk. The taller sides of the Gothic style structures provide more usable space along the sides for working and crop production. In particular, if you plan to grow tomatoes, some trellis systems require the greater height for interior and perimeter rows. Gothic style tunnels typically have higher roll-up sides, providing better airflow over taller crops. What seasons do you want to grow in? Some styles are better for warm season crops, while others are better for winter growing. Choose your structure based on the season and the crops you intend to emphasize. For instance, if you're unsure that you'll have the time and energy to continue production through the fall and winter, Choose a structure and add-ons based on summer crop production. If you're already busy in the summer growing season or investing in a tunnel for season extension, consider options that best support cool season production. Key characteristics to consider for summer production. Be sure the structure has good ventilation and possibly fans for summer production. Taller roof height and vents in the roof and in the end walls allow hot air to escape and draws cool air into the structure, improving airflow through the side vents and out vents in the roof or end walls. Tunnels with higher ceilings have better airflow over the plants. Tunnels with higher sidewalls have better airflow in hot summer months. Large doors or end walls that can be completely removed provide for better ventilation. Very wide tunnels are more difficult to get enough cross ventilation just with roll-up sides. And the open roll-up sides on the ground-to-ground Quonset-style tunnels can expose some of the crops to rain and other adverse weather. Key characteristics to consider for fall and winter production. A low structure will heat up more quickly than a taller structure. A long, narrow structure will cool down more quickly than a short structure and a wide structure. A Gothic shape will be warmer than a Quonset shape. And wide tunnels are easier to manage and keep in heat if you're doing winter production. Double poly covering will retain heat better, particularly the fan-filled insulation layer of air between the two layers of poly. A tall baseboard will protect plants on the edge beds and keep in the heat. Note that treated lumber is not allowed to be in contact with the soil for certified organic production when crops are grown in the soil. Another option is to use straw bales or other insulating material to keep cold air out, particularly for quick hoops or movable tunnels. However, using straw bales carries the risk of increasing redness near or in the tunnel. The heating system is used. Costs will be lower for structures with a lower roof, short and wide versus long and narrow, double poly versus single poly, and Gothic shape versus Quonset shape, other characteristics being equal. What's worth paying for? Of course, this is a question only individual operators can answer. Based on responses to the survey and follow-up interviews with Indiana high tunnel growers and other conversations, the list below includes more expensive options commonly purchased and recommended by experienced growers. Number one is high-quality poly. Spend the additional money on the front end to purchase a higher quality, longer lasting polyethylene cover as you will gain extra seasons or years from the extra investment. Secondly, heavier gauge steel. It is worth investing in heavier gauge steel with a structure if you are given the choice. Heavier gauge will withstand higher winds, snow loads, and therefore last more seasons. Invest in the structure. Gothic style tunnels typically cost more, but their higher ceilings are much better for ventilation through higher gable and end wall vents. In addition, their angled roof sheds water that condenses on the interior of the plastic rather than dripping on the plants below. It is important to avoid extra moisture as much as possible. The height of both Gothic and Quonset structures can be increased by using longer ground posts, offsetting some of the disadvantages of a simple Quonset. Ventilation. A typical high tunnel uses sidewalls that can be opened as the main means of ventilation. Good ventilation is critical for crop production, especially in the summer. Additional ventilation options add cost, but may be worth it. Roof vents are especially helpful for summer production of trellis crops like tomatoes. End wall vents near the peak, sometimes called gabled vents, these are especially helpful for winter growing and in the shoulder seasons when it would be too cold to open the sides, but ventilation is needed for cooling or to reduce humidity. Thermostatically controlled automated vents and or roll-up sides, these are especially useful for the shoulder seasons and when it is difficult for someone to be on hand to manually open and close the sides. For instance, on a cool spring or fall day, the temperatures can spike suddenly when the sun emerges on an otherwise cloudy day. Farmers without automation need to always have the tunnel in the back of their minds and be ready to stop what they're doing and adjust accordingly. Exhaust fans. These are useful when paired with vents on opposite walls. They speed up the air exchange. Finally, adequate airflow is important for maintaining a more stable temperature at the level of the plants. Sufficient airflow over your plants is particularly important if you're growing tomatoes with the trellis system. But also for winter greens, you'll need to get air moving over the plants even when it's cold out. Ventilation is key to managing certain diseases. Air movement also moves plants, stimulating changes in cell walls that make plants sturdier and not weak. Movable tunnels. Several systems are used for moving tunnels. Clockwise from left, image A is a movable tunnel system showing 3 tunnels that each can be dragged lengthwise in different footprints. You can see they're at different stages. Image B is a caterpillar tunnels that are moved sideways by removing the plastic, pulling up the end of each hoop, and flipping it 180 degrees, then recovering. The area between the 2 tunnels in this image is covered by a tunnel 1 out of 3 seasons. A finished crop of tomatoes and a cover crop are visible in the image. Image C is a tunnel on rails that can be rolled to cover sections in the foreground. Images D and E are components of tunnels on a metal sled showing sidewall posts cabled to ground anchors and metal baseboard sled. Close up of the ground anchor and a metal sled. Movable tunnels are designed to be able to be moved to cover a different plot of soil, usually an adjacent plot in line with the others. 3 main systems are common. In one, the frame has wheels at the base of the bows and rests on a rail along with which it can be rolled. In the second system, the frame rests on a sled which can be dragged to the new location. In the third system, a simple hoop structure with no baseboard or hipboard and only a center ridge pole connecting the bows is moved sideways by lifting the ends of each bow on one side of the structure and rotating it 180 degrees and anchoring it to the ground in the new location. To get full use of movable tunnel requires careful planning and crop rotations, planting dates, and plans for moving, and extra help as well. Site selection and preparation. Growers need to ask, what kind of site do I have available? Am I in a high wind area? Does my area get heavy snow? Site considerations include remembering to orient your tunnel to avoid shade and maximize sun exposure for light and heat, particularly if you're planning for fall and winter production. The rule of thumb is 2 times the height equals the distance from other structures to avoid the shading. So if the trees are 50 feet tall, you need to be about 100 feet away when you set your tunnel down, and that's if the trees are at their terminal stage of growth. Many trees might grow taller than that. Site tunnels downwind of existing tree rows, but outside of shade areas for wind protection. Consider planting a windbreak that could help reduce impacts from wind or snow. An east-west orientation will allow more sunlight in the structure in the winter, and this is often recommended for winter production above the 40-degree latitude line. Since Indiana ranges from 39 to 40 degrees north, orientation is not as critical as for more northern areas. Gutter-connected structures should be oriented with the long axis north and south. Major ventilation openings, such as roll-up sides, should be oriented perpendicular to the direction of the prevailing winds. Will your site work for electric hookups? Consider siting your tunnel so that it fits the flow of your farm. The closer it is to the main activity and main walking paths, the better. Be sure that flow to and from the structure for harvest, planting, and vehicles is all accounted for. Do you have water source? Is it frost-free? Plan a site to accommodate space and access for future structures. Take time to prepare the site well. How you lay out your high tunnel is so important for success. Take the time to level the site well and square it off. Find a location with where the natural slope is less than 5%. Soil preparation before putting up the tunnel is crucial. Consider applying high-quality compost and organic matter, lime if needed to adjust pH, remove perennial weeds, address any compaction issues, and anything else you won't be able to do once the end walls are framed in. If running water and electric to the tunnel prior to build, be sure all groundwork is done and tunnel location is set. Never in lines where ground posts will go. Take the time to put in drainage. Many growers have had to retrofit drainage around tunnels after having water flowing through their tunnel or seeping in on one side or another. You need a way to move water away from the structure during heavy rains or heavy snow and the snow is melt to avoid flooding interior soils and limiting freezing in winter months. It can be a challenge to get your drainage system right before constructing your tunnel, but be sure to at least develop a plan when you site the tunnel. Many farmers regretted not planning for drainage ahead of time. Even if the site is not wet, realize that rainwater that falls on the tunnel will need to go somewhere, as will water from the snow melt. Prepare for high winds. So among many things that the farmers talked about and challenges that they've had with the high tunnels, this is the one that structurally emerges as the strongest issue in dealing with high winds, particularly in the northern part of the state. Among the 130 farmers we spoke with and learned from, most considered weather the most challenging aspect for successful siting of high tunnels. Many farmers spoke about losing quality to windstorms and having plants quickly exposed to frigid conditions, driving rain, etc. Rather than learning from your trial and error, consider the following. Know where the prevailing winds come from in your area. Position the high tunnel near a windbreak that won't shade your structure. Use support straps on the outside of the polyethylene, covering the juncture of where the polyethylene stretches over trusses, braces, and ribs. Use concrete at the base of ground posts. In very high wind areas, consider ground anchors in addition to ground posts. When bad weather is coming, it is best practice to batten down the hatches. All doors, vents, and sides should be closed and secured. If strong winds get into the tunnel, the structure acts like an airplane wing and tries to take off, putting additional stress on plastic and structure and pulling posts out of the ground. Wind speed. Wind can cause serious damage to high tunnels. The photos show a high tunnel with bent metal structure and ground posts pulled out of the ground. Sustained wind speed over 20 miles per hour and wind gusts over 50 miles per hour were recorded on a nearby weather station. The arrow in the photo on the left points to a vertical post installed after the damage to reinforce the wind curtain end walls and prevent it from billowing inwards. And that concludes this first part of the presentation, as we can switch to the Q&A before hearing from Kara Bergschneider.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to share with you a success story from New Ground Farm. New Ground Farm is owned by Mike and Liesl Record, and it's a certified organic diverse vegetable operation on about 30 acres, of which 2.5 acres are currently being grown. The land has been in production since about 2013, although Mike and Liesl farmed and managed an organic farm in Colorado previously, so they had extensive growing experience before moving to the Bloomington area. They sell their produce at the Bloomington Farmers Market, at an on-farm stand, and at a local grocery store. And at the next slide, we can see some of the common conservation practices that they implement every year. They're extensive cover crop growers. They have great crop rotations. They use oculation, and they have an integrated pest management through exclusion and scouting. So Mike and Liesl came to me with NRCS interested in applying for an EQIP grant for a high tunnel. They had been hearing about high tunnels, and Mike had a little bit of experience in growing in high tunnels in Colorado before moving here. And so we put together, after a site visit and talking about their farm, what they'd like to accomplish, we put together an application for cover crops, pollinator habitat, and a high tunnel. And the application was selected for funding in 2016. And so they were ready to go right away. And what we see on the left-hand side of this slide is the extensive grading that they needed to complete in order for their site preparation. Unfortunately, and very commonly in Monroe and Brown County, we do not have a lot of flat ground. And so site preparation is really important. And so they were at about a 10% slope and went to about a 1% slope with grading. The high tunnel was constructed, and then they installed gutters and an underground outlet to deal with the concentrated flow of the high tunnel and to avoid some of the issues that James was talking about with water coming into the tunnel, and then in their case in particular with erosion coming off of the steep sides of the high tunnel. And so in the next slide, we see some of their production. So this high tunnel really expanded and extended their growing season. It allowed them to do winter production, which they were not doing before. In November of 2016, so the tunnel was completed in September of 2016, they did some soil remediation and improvement in October, and then in November of 2016, they transplanted greens into the high tunnel, and they were able to harvest greens starting in February, which is about 2 months earlier than normal. this early harvest opened up the grocery store market for them because they had high quality produce early in the season. In 2017, they grew a summer crop, and that crop grew until December of this year, and they actually had to go in and physically kill their tomato and pepper plants so that they could get their next crop in. They planted spring greens and root crops in February of 2018, and he has already been harvesting his greens and selling those at an early farmer's market and at grocery stores as well. At the next slide, I don't have a picture of their summer production, but you can see the high tunnel in the background. And what Mike said is the real difference has been in his summer production of tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. He's nearly doubled the quantity of the fruit in the same amount of space, and the quality has drastically improved due to the regulation of water and wind, as well as a decrease in disease. And this has allowed him to charge a premium and just to have a better product and more of his product. And that has really opened up his on-farm stand, which we see in this picture. Next slide, we see that based on the growth, so on the left-hand side, we see the high tunnel that he put up in 2016 through EQIP, and to the right, he's currently right now building a second high tunnel with his own, without NRCS's help or through EQIP. And he has seen, and he decided to do the second high tunnel based on an extension of the growing season, the reduction of disease, the increase in the quality and quantity of fruit, and that higher market value. On the last slide, we see a couple of challenges that Mike has ran into. And he told me that I would be remiss if I just talked about, as like a good farmer, if I just talked about his successes and not the challenges. I mentioned the site grading, extensive site grading that he had to do, and he said that in retrospect, he is so thankful for the high tunnel and expanding and building a new high tunnel so that he'll have 2 high tunnels to grow in. But if he were to do it over again, he would not have graded his site. He would have brought in topsoil so that he had a higher quality soil to be growing in. He's really struggled with improving his soil to the level and to the soil health level that he would like to have it at. And then secondly, he wanted me to mention not to underestimate the importance of dealing with your drainage. He has gutters and an underground outlet, but he said that there were a couple of months where he did not deal with his drainage, and he said that that would be his advice to other growers, is to consider those 2 things.
We'll get started again. I'm Liz Maynard, a Vegetable Extension Specialist with Purdue University in the Horticulture Department. I'm based in Northern Indiana. And I'll be going through some of the highlights of the production section of the handbook that we're putting together. And it's not meant to provide all the detail, but to let you know what is included in the handbook. So starting with planting dates, of course the planting dates in tunnels are determined largely by marketing plans, but given that, the temperatures in the tunnel and requirements of the particular crop. And warm season crops like tomatoes, peppers, and melons need air temperature above 50, and soil temperature should also be in the 50s. And temperatures below 45 or 50 can injure warm season crops, especially those very tender crops like cucumbers and melons. Of course, if you have freezing, it'll cause even more injury and can kill the warm season crops. Without supplemental heat, transplanting tomatoes into high tunnels about a month before the frost-free date in an area is about right. And it may very well still be necessary to protect them from frost with row covers. More tender crops could go in about 2 weeks later. Most of the cool season crops for late fall and winter harvest should be planted mid to late August or early September for the greatest yield potential. And Michael will be covering planting schedules for winter crops in more detail. The space in a high tunnel is valuable, so it's important to use it efficiently, of course. Many growers plant on 2 to 3 foot beds separated by 1 to 2 foot walkways, and then tall crops that support themselves or supported by stakes or trellises take advantage of the vertical space as well. For those tall crops, beds or rows centered 4 to 6 feet apart are common for things like tomatoes and peppers, with 1 or 2 rows per bed. Greens are often planted multiple rows to a bed, with rows maybe 3 to 6 inches apart, and for baby greens in very dense plantings, like you see on the lower left. The microenvironment varies in the tunnel, so when growing multiple kinds of crops, to the extent possible, it's good to put crops where they're best adapted. Edges of the tunnel tend to be colder, so cold-hardy crops like spinach along the edges make sense. Bed size and arrangement influence the efficiency of work as well as the effective growing area. And for a given bed and alley width, long waste beds will provide more plantable square feet. Long waste beds are often easier to prepare with equipment and also make moving plants and your harvested crops in and out of the tunnel easier. We've included a table like this in the handbook, and it shows the plantable area and the linear bed feet for different bed widths, numbers of beds, and alley widths if beds are oriented long ways or crossways. Soil in high tunnels that's well managed will provide an environment where roots grow easily, plants benefit from interactions with soil microorganisms. You've got enough mineral nutrients available and in sufficient supply for healthy plant growth, and any pathogens, weed seeds, and pests aren't reducing yield or quality. Many growers grow in the soil, as you see in the tomatoes in the top middle of the picture, the greens on the lower left. And so they're managing fertility in the soil is important. There are also people who grow in bags or pots like you see in the upper right. And in a bag or a pot system, it's really close to a hydroponic system, and developing fertilizer plans based on a hydroponic system is what should be done in that case. I'll be focusing on soil-based systems here. People we talked with, many growers use compost, organic fertilizers. Another subset also use soluble fertilizers and inject it through drip irrigation, as you see in the top left. I wanted to mention some likely issues with soil health in high tunnels. One problem is chemical imbalances. Without rain and snow to leach, excess salts and nutrients can build up. If alkaline water is used for irrigation, pH can increase. And then on the physical side, the intensive production means there's likelihood for compaction, loss of structure, possibly loss of organic matter, although some research has not shown loss of organic matter. Then soil pests and disease problems can build up if crops aren't rotated, and often they aren't because of the high value of the crops that are grown there. Avoiding and correcting chemical issues involves testing the soil, monitoring the mineral and the nutrient content of irrigation water, of fertilizers, any soil amendments, and using a nutrient balance approach for fertilizing. In-season checks of the crop's nutrient status with tissue tests are really helpful. And I think especially for growing in tunnels, because the production system is a little bit different than outside, the crops may have a more restricted rooting zone, they may be growing a little more quickly, that taking periodic tissue tests can help growers understand whether the crops are what the nutrient status of the crops are. Being prepared to leach if salts become excessive is helpful. If too much fertilizer is being put on, it's certainly possible to build up salts to the point where they can injure the crop. Solutions to problems of compaction can involve controlling foot traffic, limit it to the pathways, using beds, either raised beds or well-delimited beds. Defined beds can help people stay in the pathways. Adding organic matter is really very important. If mulches like straw or dead leaves are being used for weed control, as they get worked in, they will add organic matter. Of course, it's important to take into account if those mulches have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio like straw or leaves, that they not be worked in right where the crop is growing because they may tie up the nitrogen. Composts for nutrients are another way to add organic matter, using cover crops, and crop residue can be a possibility, although oftentimes it's better to remove that crop residue if it's going to be a source of disease. Any amendment that is added, the nutrient contribution of that amendment should be considered so that you're not over applying any nutrient. Phosphorus applied in compost easily builds up well beyond crop needs. Movable tunnels can make it easier to use a cover crop. As you see in the two pictures at the lower left, cover crops used with movable tunnels, but it's also possible to have cover crops in stationary tunnels. Let's say some growers are using tillage implements like power harrows that are supposed to not create a compacted layer as much as a rotary tiller would. Irrigation is necessary in high tunnel production. You've basically got a desert environment in there without it. During the summer months, full-size crops will require more than an inch of water a week or more than 1,800 gallons in a 30 by 96 foot structure. In winter, the requirement's much lower. Well water is commonly used, but some growers use municipal or other public water supply, surface water from a pond or a stream, or runoff from the high tunnel roof, as you see in the lower two pictures on the right, where a gutter is collecting runoff. It's directed to a holding tank, and then water from that tank is pumped up to a tank where the drip irrigation is connected to. Of course, the water sources should be tested to check for their suitability for irrigation, and not only their chemical suitability, but also the microbial quality of the water is important. That's especially important when using surface water, which would include ponds, streams, and any water collected off the surface of the tunnel. It's important to have a plan to check that for microbes that could cause human disease. Drip irrigation is often used in high tunnels. Over 3/4 of the people who responded to our survey used it. Hand watering is common, used by about 1/3, and almost 20% use sprinklers. It's not unusual to have more than one system of watering. An overhead system and or sprinkler system, like you see in the top right of this slide, is useful for narrow rows of direct seeded crops when putting out a lot of drip lines would just be labor intensive, or for wetting the soil profile before transplanting a crop like tomatoes in the spring. Insect and disease management involves awareness of pests, correct identification of what you've got, knowing their life cycles, knowing how to scout for the problems and finding a way to do it efficiently, and then making use of a variety of strategies to reduce the damage. I want to emphasize managing the environment here, and James mentioned this a little bit, but reducing humidity is important for limiting many diseases. And that's done by venting, making sure you have good airflow when those vents are open, having good drainage so you don't have wet soil contributing to humidity. And if you're using row covers in the winter or any time, removing them so that the crops can dry off because it'll get more humid under there. On the right are listed the common insect and disease management practices that are used. The crop rotation, while often it's not used because, as I said, the most valuable crops are what people want to grow. If it's possible to do that, that is helpful. Sanitation is really key, especially if you aren't rotating crops. Get old crop residue out of there, sanitize any mulches that you're reusing, and just practice good sanitation throughout production. Resistant varieties are available for some diseases. Grafting can help, for instance, with tomatoes with some of the soil-borne wilts. Providing habitat for natural enemies is something that the Purdue researchers are looking at for better insect control. Excluding pests with row covers or netting is also an option. And then if pesticides are used, be aware that the pesticide label must permit use in a greenhouse. High tunnels are considered greenhouses for the purpose of pesticide use in Indiana. Some of the common insects or mites and diseases in Indiana's tunnels, and certainly not all of them, but just some highlights. Aphids often become problems on crops in late winter and early spring, like on the spinach in the top left here. Mites tend to show up in hot, dry areas first. Cukes are common hosts, but mites can also get on tomatoes. Cucumber beetles can be a serious problem on cucumbers, especially because they transmit bacterial wilt, which is fatal to cucumbers and cantaloupes. Moths seem to collect in high tunnels if the sides are open at night, and their larvae, the caterpillars, can do serious damage to tomato fruit, like the yellow striped caterpillar here and the tiny hornworm that you see there. Scouting, and so that you're aware of when these insect or mite populations are just getting started, can really help in terms of being able to manage them and prevent serious damage. The diseases shown here include leaf mold, which is a common foliar disease on tomatoes. There are some varieties that have more resistance than others to that. And then timber rot, which will girdle the tomato stem, cause the whole plant to wilt and kill it. The organism that causes timber rot can also cause bottom rot on lettuce, which you see there, and can also attack kale as well as many other vegetables. That pathogen, sclerotinia, can survive many years in the soil, and it's a problem that can build up over time. So being aware of these and knowing how to identify them is the first step in managing them. For weed management, and James mentioned this as well, it really begins before you construct the tunnel by managing any perennial weeds that are on your site or choosing a site without perennial weeds. Preventive awareness, like not bringing in seed or weed propagules in your soil, your compost, mulch, or anything, is really important. Some of the techniques that are used are creating a stale seed bed, using dense plantings, especially of those smaller crops. Design your planting arrangement, your bed shape, the size, your row width, and so on, so that it'll work with the weeding tools that you have. Mulches are commonly used, whether it's a straw, dead leaves, or a plastic mulch, or a woven weed barrier, commonly used and can be really helpful in managing weeds. If irrigation can be directed just to the zones where the crops are, you'll have less weeds in the other areas of the tunnel. Briefly about environmental management, and I want to focus on temperature here. In the tunnel, when it's sunny out, the sun rays come into the tunnel, they bounce off the ground, and the longer waves can't escape, and so it warms up inside the tunnel, the air and the soil. At night, that heat is lost to the air, lost through the plastic, and the tunnel cools down. If there's an insulating layer put over the soil, like this white semicircle, which is meant to indicate row cover, that will trap heat next to the soil and it will stay warmer in there at night. A single layer of plastic does not trap heat very well. It's very likely to get almost as cold as outside. A double poly layer of plastic with air inflated in between and or a row cover will help increase the temperature at night. In the spring and summer, I want to mention the danger is often that it gets too hot. And I just want to show you some temperature data just from earlier in April at the research farm here in northern Indiana. Here you can see temperature graphs for 2 high tunnels, and you can see the daily up and down in temperature. And look over on the right on April 12th. In High Tunnel 1, the sidewalls are opening when it gets above 70 degrees, and the high temperature in there was 80 degrees on the 12th. Outside high that day was 75. But look in the other High Tunnel 2, the lower graph. Those sidewalls did not open up, and it got up to 100 degrees in there. If there were crops in there, that would be too hot. You'd see some pretty stressed plants. Look earlier that week on, I guess, April 7th. It went from 20 to over 80 in that High Tunnel 2 in 5 hours. So temperature can increase really rapidly. James mentioned you need to be on the ball to open vents. And then look at the, I guess, the morning of April 8th. Inside, it got down to 18 degrees. Outside was 16 degrees. This is a single layer tunnel, so it loses heat very rapidly, even though it gets so warm during the day. So this is a case, a reminder that when you're starting things in the spring, being prepared to put on row cover, possibly add some emergency heat for those tender crops is really important. And yet you also have to be aware that it may get too hot. You'll need to vent. James mentioned many of the ventilation systems that are used, and they're just more pictures of some of those different sidewalls, end walls, and so on. Another thing I wanted to mention in this slide is look at the top left and middle images. You'll see shade cloth. Shade cloth is a way to reduce the heat in the tunnel, and many growers use it for tomatoes, especially in southern Indiana. They may be using like a 30% shade cloth. The other thing I wanted to mention is on the lower right, there are some non-electric or non-grid options for automating vents. A solar-powered thermostatically controlled sidewall motor, it's possible to get. They're not inexpensive, but they can be helpful for raising and lowering sides if you're not on the grid. And then there are relatively inexpensive wax-based vent openers that can open a end wall vent just as it warms up. It has a little piston in there with wax inside, and as it heats up, the piston will push the vent open. And with that, I think we're ready to take questions for this section if we have some time.
All right, so as was mentioned, Michael O'Donnell, I'm a Purdue Extension organic and diversified agriculture educator. I'm based out of the Delaware County Extension Office in Muncie. I'm going to share quickly and try to summarize some of the things that Liz and I learned in the USDA SARE funded project, where we are looking specifically at cool season vegetable production during the winter months, or harvest during the winter months, in different types of protected structures. And by protected structures, I mean not just high tunnels, but we also looked at low tunnels and caterpillar tunnels and various structures like that, but generally speaking about unheated high tunnels. So we're not talking about this. I think that's clear from what we've been discussing so far during this webinar. We're not talking about these sophisticated greenhouses where we're growing, warm season crops completely out of season, full climate control and things like that. We're talking about these lower capital expense structures, generally unheated, might have minimal heat, where we maintain a low temperature threshold to keep temperatures above freezing or slightly below freezing, which allows us to keep a wider diversity of cool season crops and maybe improve productivity. But we're looking at cool season crops, a lot of leafy greens, things like that. So as James talked about, for those farmers who might just be using high tunnels to extend the growing season with warm season crops like tomatoes and green peppers, cucumbers, looking at these cool season crops during the winter is a great way to diversify the use of structures. If you're going to make that kind of, capital expenditure and investment in infrastructure, let's look at how to fully utilize it. It can help to increase overall income and maintain, I think importantly, maintain relationships with customers through all 4 seasons, rather than letting that customer relationship in for several months during the winter. We can keep that going. Liz talked about how it's important to let markets drive production. So before filling up a tunnel with all these leafy greens and other crops during the winter, let's make sure we know where we're going to go with those crops. Do we have a winter farmers market we can go to? Do we have chefs or other buyers that are interested in buying through the winter months? And I think I like to talk about how there's kind of a value proposition here for Indiana growers to get into winter production, and particularly with leafy greens, so that we can displace a lot of the imported leafy greens, that are coming in from Yuma, Arizona, and Mexico during this time of year. I think that Indiana growers really are in a position to offer a high quality, locally produced leafy greens during the winter months, a lot of the winter months. And ultimately, if that product is produced well and harvested properly, and we have good post-harvest handling, we can end up with a product with significantly longer shelf life. So I think it's a value proposition for Indiana growers versus the stuff coming in from the West. But it's important to keep in mind some of the things that James talked about. Depending on the features of a high tunnel growing during the winter, it can impact quality of life. So if you don't have automated venting, you're stuck, okay, on sunny days when the sun comes out. Liz talked about how the temperatures can spike rapidly, and we've got to be around to vent that structure and remove internal row covers so that our plants aren't overheating and stressing. So if it's a grower who likes to get away during the winter and not be tied to the farm, then this kind of production might not be for them, or they need to look at investing in automation of venting. And there are going to be some other infrastructure considerations. So you need to think about the entire production cycle, not just the fact that we're putting some different crops in the tunnel during the winter, but what is it going to take not just to efficiently grow and harvest, but also post-harvest? Do we have a heated indoor wash pack facility for handling greens so that we're comfortable during that part of the production cycle? Do we have product storage that can be heated to maintain a temperature that's not freezing if that product storage is a walk-in cooler that's outside? I already talked about ventilation, and then we saw the picture that Kara shared from Mike Records' farm with all the snow piled up. When we do get snow and ice, is our high tunnel designed such that we can easily get in and out and get that snow and ice away, so that when we need to get in and harvest crops, we're not stuck with a frozen door and we can't get in there. So you need to think about the whole system. All right, so quickly, some of the things I'll touch on. Mainly, I'm going to talk about timing, scheduling of plantings, and how important that is to get good yield. Some of the challenges with balancing warm and cool season crops, okay, we're competing for space, especially in stationary tunnels. We can look at movable tunnels to deal with that balance between warm and cool season crops. And I'm going to mention this several times, how important, each farm is unique, has its own microclimate and its own context. So it's important for growers to observe and monitor and keep good records to inform their decision-making from year to year. And then this idea of managing the growing environment, particularly in our unheated structures, where we have kind of limited control over our environmental conditions, and mainly it comes down to managing internal row covers and venting of our structure. Okay, so in this project, we worked with 3 farmers, Ben Hartman at Clay Bottom Farm up in Goshen, up in the north part of the state, Nathan Fingerly, River Ridge Farm in Rowan, Wabash County, and David Robb at Eden Prairie Farm in Greenfield. So we had a nice range of latitude that we were looking at, and you'll see some of the data that we collected. Also collected data both as part of the SARE project and the previously mentioned Specialty Crop Block Grant up at the Purdue AG Center. Liz is based up north. So we had a number of different structures that we were looking at, collecting environmental data and collecting crop harvest, planting and harvest information. So what kind of crops are we talking about? Briefly, leafy greens is huge. That's where a lot of farmers are focused. It's a high value crop. So things like mizuna, various mustards, arugula, spinach, these crops typically being direct seeded. And we can come through and do multi-cut harvest or individual harvesting of leaves like the spinach on the right over time. So it's not just typically not just a single harvest, something we can cut and come back and harvest again. Other leafy greens, kale, Swiss chard that we see here, where they're growing up to full leaf size. And we can harvest those leaves over time, over an extended period for bundled leaf sales. Both of these could also be direct seeded and grown as baby leaf, but generally I'm seeing where we're growing to full leaf size. Then single harvest type crops, so head lettuces, some of the Asian head leafy greens like the bok choy on the right, so those that grow up to a certain size, we cut them and just harvest once. And then some root crops, some growers are doing salad turnips like these Hakurai turnips on the left, radishes on the right. Generally, some of these won't hold up well as we get into those really cold nights, and other growers may choose not to produce them versus some of those leafy greens that may have higher return per square foot in those high tunnels. This is a more comprehensive list. It's taken from one of Elliott Coleman's books, The Winter Harvest Handbook, published in 2009. A great reference. Elliott Coleman has been kind of a pioneer in 4-season growing, and you can see a large variety of different crops, hardy leafy greens, that maybe some folks aren't used to. And it shows generally the windows that he would expect in his Zone 5 area up on the coast of Maine. So a higher latitude, but a zone similar to Indiana. And you can see a lot of these he's able to harvest, keep in a cold house, which is an unheated high tunnel, for all 4 seasons. But I think that some of the most popular crops that we're seeing with growers, and I think that was mentioned earlier, is spinach, lettuces, mustards, and kale, with spinach and kale being by far the most reliable and popular crops through the most challenging months of late December and January and February. Okay, so getting on to timing and how crucial this is. This is some data that Liz Maynard collected at the Penny Pack up north. This is for a variety of kale, darky boar kale. And the chart and the table both show the same information, where we have the transplant date, so a seedling kale that was transplanted into the high tunnel, the date that it was transplanted, versus from the date of that transplant until we had our first harvest. And this was harvested at a specific full leaf size as if we were doing bundled kale. So you can see for those earlier planting dates in late August, mid-September, that the days to harvest is not influenced. But then as we start to move into late September, mid-October, that days to first harvest increases very rapidly, okay? Next, of mid-October transplant, we're not harvesting until the next year, over 3 months later. If we translate that into markable weight, and potential sales, you can see how drastically that drops off. And this is assuming harvest from that first harvest when we're up to harvestable size or the desired size, up until we stop harvesting any of these March 14th, with the idea being that a lot of these plants are going to be bolting, and we want to pull these kale plants and start to make way for our early warm season crops. Okay, so by delaying that planting, we're losing yield potential and obviously sales potential. Another example here is direct seeded spinach variety Gazelle. Again, it's penny Purdue AG Center. And we see the same trend, those early direct seedings from the end of August. In this case, we can extend the spinach a little bit longer because it's a shorter days to maturity. So we can take this out to about October, mid-October, and still have harvests that begin during the fall, okay, during the same year. But as soon as we get beyond that mid-October time frame, we see again this drastic increase in how long it takes before the crop gets to harvestable size. So there's sort of this threshold depending on how long crops take to get to maturity, where that days to harvest really just jumps up quickly, and we're looking at significant delays in a harvestable crop. We can translate this again to marketable yield, and we see that same trend that we saw with the kale, where delayed plantings, overall we have less marketable yield for a given harvest window through mid-March. Okay, so timing's crucial if we want to be getting crops in that late fall and during the winter months. And what's driving this? It's pretty obvious, right? We all know that as we progress from late summer through the fall, that our days are getting shorter, we have less light, so that means longer time to harvest, right? Because light drives that growth. One of the parameters that we look at with this research is this parameter called daily light integral. That's essentially the amount of light energy that falls on a unit area in a given day. Okay, and this chart shows daily light integral at one of our farms that we worked with from September through March. And as you'd expect, that amount of light, it varies from day to day, whether it's overcast or sunny. But the trend as our days get shorter is that daily light integral goes down until we hit winter and our days start getting longer, and it starts to slowly come back up. And when we talk about crop growth, once we get below a threshold of about 10 on daily light integral, crop growth more or less stops. Okay, and as you can see here in Indiana, we get below that DLI of 10 in about the middle of November, and then we start to get back over it towards the end of January. And interestingly, that coincides about exactly with when our length of day from sunrise to sunset is about 10 hours or less. Okay, so less than 10 DLI, this daily light integral, or daylight less than 10 hours is essentially when crop growth stops. It's a period of the year that Elliot Coleman has called the Persephone. It's has some tie to Greek mythology, but the strategy is essentially that we want to get our crops in early enough so that they're up to marketable size by the time we hit this Persephone, or days shorter than 10 hours. And then our crops are more or less in kind of storage mode in ground in our and we sequentially harvest those crops through the Persephone, and then we can see crop growth resume as we come back out and have day length greater than 10 hours. Okay, another important thing obviously is temperature. It's not just light, and as we all know, as we go through the fall and into the winter, our average temperature, which we can correlate to growing degree days, means that we have longer time to harvest. So light and temperature are driving this. I'm not going to dwell on this too much. Want to move on to the next slide here. So if we look at growing degree days from the time that we put a crop in the ground, so each of these charts are for different tunnels, but we're looking at putting a ground in late September, early October, and the growing degrees start to accumulate. So we're taking growing degree days each day and summing them over time, so it's cumulative. And you can see outside that, you know, by the time we reach that mid-November, we're really accumulating no growing degree days until we start to get into the later winter months when those growing degree days start to accumulate again. And by moving our environment, our growing environment, into a tunnel, whether it's an unheated tunnel with row cover, or a minimally heated tunnel where we're maintaining, you know, maybe a minimal temperature with heating at freezing, we continue to accumulate growing degree days so we can get a little bit of growth and have a more favorable growing environment for these crops. All right, so scheduling. What are some resources to help growers figure out when to get these crops in the ground? This is again taken from one of Elliot Coleman's books. I'm not going to dwell on this. If you download the slides, you can pull this and look at it more closely. But basically, it's a correlation between planting dates and number of days from planting to harvest for a crop that I believe would have a days to maturity of 40 days on the seed packet. And it's comparing a minimally heated tunnel to an unheated tunnel. Another resource, Johnny's Selected Seeds has a winter growing guide and this nice chart that helps growers think about when to get crops in the ground for winter harvest. You can look up your last last 10-hour day in the fall, and then again in the winter when we resume 10-hour days. And then basically, so this chart is for crops that we would harvest, that we would put in the ground in late summer or fall to harvest during the winter. So we work backwards from that last 10-hour day in the fall. So I have an example here for Muncie. Ours here, our last 10-hour day is about November 13th. So we just work backwards by week for these different crops, and that tells us when we put them in the ground. So in this example, let's look at the full leaf kale here at the bottom. We would need to seed that crop in flats the first couple weeks of August, and then transplant it into our tunnels the first couple weeks of September to have harvest in late fall and through the winter months. Okay, so great scheduling tool that the growers can download. And then versus, instead of harvest during the winter, if we're delayed, say we have a tomato crop that we don't pull out early, we could look at overwintering crops that we would seed into the tunnels or transplant into the tunnels during the winter months, but we wouldn't expect to start harvesting until the spring. Okay, so a similar kind of chart, but in this case, we pull our last 10-hour day from the spring or from the winter. So in Muncie, that would be January 27th, and we'd work backwards by weeks for when we get these in the ground. Okay, so you can download this one online, share it with growers. Michigan State University Student Organic Farm, they publish their seeding dates online. You can download those. Not going to dwell on this, just another resource that you can look up later. They have both their late summer and fall seedings, and then their early spring seedings. And then Coleman also in his book again has different seeding dates during the fall for winter harvest. Okay, lastly, with scheduling and timing, growers can start with those various resources to get an idea of when to get crops out initially. But again, each farm is unique, different tunnels, different environment, different climate. They should keep records. I won't go into all the details of this. This is just a nice, simple way that we found to keep records during this research project, working with that set of growers, where at the time of seeding and transplanting, we would write just this simple information onto a wooden stake and just stick it right in the ground with that crop. We'd use a water-resistant marker so it doesn't smear or stain. And then when that crop is harvested and done, we can collect up those wooden stakes, save them for the end of the season or when we have time, and then transcribe those into a spreadsheet or written record and see what everything looked like from seeding to first harvest and last harvest. Okay, so you can take a look at this later if you download the slides and look at some of the details. Just a nice, efficient way to keep records. So over time, if growers do that, you can essentially build your own scheduling with different seeding dates and keeping good records from planting to harvest, and find out when these thresholds are in the fall for when you're a little too late getting crops in and result in a very long days to harvest. Okay, so keeping good records can help growers make their own schedules like this. I talked about balancing crops, competing space, particularly in stationary tunnels. These are some images from growers we've worked with, just showing how making decisions, it's going to be unique to each farm of when am I pulling warm season crops that could continue to be productive through September, October, even November. Southern Indiana probably into December, but recognizing that if I want to be harvesting some of these season crops in November, December, January, February, they've got to get in August, September, and the first part of October. So that's going to have to be something that each grower looks at that's unique to their farm, and just make those decisions on what their markets need, and when they're going to pull crops out and make room for the next. In the interest of time, I see that I'm running out of time here. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I apologize for this. But I want to talk about managing the environment. Okay, so row covers, we've heard those mentioned several times. Here's a nice image of row cover draped over some internal hoops inside of a high tunnel to give added protection to crops when it gets really cold. And then some growers feel comfortable and find it easier simply to lay those row covers directly on top of crops like a blanket. Okay, then they're not having to mess with hoops, and they find that the crops aren't being damaged, and so it's just a lot easier to manage than having to put these hoops in the ground and navigate around them. Okay, but with that, these row covers will accumulate moisture. Our plants are transpiring, the soil, there's some evapotranspiration going on. So we do need to be taking these covers off, letting them dry, letting that moisture get out so that we're not promoting disease. Okay, and also so that solar radiation can get to the soil, get to the plants, warm that soil. That's the heat sink, really that drives things in an unheated tunnel. So we've got to think about managing these covers for moisture, temperature, and that solar radiation gain in our structures. So quickly, I'm going to get through this fast. Some tips for managing the environment during the winter. You got to get into watching the forecast, not just daily, but looking forward to anticipate when you have good windows to harvest, when it's not going to be overcast, in sub-zero temperatures. Anticipate venting and row cover removal in the late morning, and then closing and covering in the afternoon. That's going to be driven by, is it going to be a sunny day or an overcast day, when maybe I can ignore it and just let things stay closed up and keep things covered. As it gets colder and colder, we may add multiple layers of row cover. Some growers have rules of thumb, like once it gets below 25 or 28, they'll put one cover. Once we get below 22 or 20, we'll put 2 row covers, and so on. And keep in mind that these row covers and the plants will freeze. That plant tissue will freeze on cold nights. So the last thing you want to do is go in and remove row covers when things are still frozen. You got to let them thaw out, or you risk damaging that plant tissue. All right. If growers are interested in actually monitoring conditions in their tunnels remotely, there are some great tools. Some of them very reasonable cost. They can look them up at these various websites, but one thing to keep in mind is limitation with line of sight. So if it's remote sensing, you've got to have good line of sight to the data collector, the data logger, or these things just don't work well. All right, so in summary, planting date is huge for winter harvested crops and yield, but let markets drive your plantings and your harvest. I shared those different scheduling tools and resources that are available, but make sure that growers keep records so that they can improve their decision making with planting times in future years. Venting and managing of row covers is important for managing the environment, temperature, and relative humidity. And I talked very quickly about the monitoring equipment that's available. And if line of sight's an issue, a lot of those options are not going to be so good.
But we've posted our contact information so that you all can follow up with us if you have further questions. So thank you all very much for joining us today. As Liz mentioned, we've put together a High Tunnel Handbook for Indiana that includes all of the information we presented today in a lot more detail. So keep a lookout for that. It'll be available around July, and we'll be sending that out to you all via your listserv. So again, if you have more questions, we'd be very happy to get in touch with us. You see our contact information here.